Yay, it works. Not exactly the first slide I was planning for, but okay. Hi, everyone. Glad I started early. So, I guess I was already been introduced, but I feel I should introduce myself as well. So, hi, I'm Leah. One fun fact you might not know about me is that I grew up in Greece, and specifically in the island of Lesbos, which technically makes me geographically lesbian, probably one of the very few you'll ever meet. I like making stuff. You might have used some of my work. It's all on GitHub. I'm an invited expert in the CSS working group. My day job is doing research at MIT in HCI, which is basically the academic term for usability, and specifically end-user programming. And I wrote a book on CSS. It's called CSS Secrets. It's awesome. You should totally get it. So you might be wondering, it's CSS Day. My background is in CSS. Why am I doing a talk on HTML? I don't know either, but they invited me to speak at the HTML special, and I was struggling for so long to find a topic. What can I talk about? It's HTML. I mean, it's not, there isn't that much stuff that people don't know about. And then we did this study at MIT, and it was related to HTML because we were testing our work. We're working on something that will enable people to do more with HTML, so HTML was kind of related to it. And even though it was not actually the objective of the study, I realized that even people who rated themselves as advanced or expert, there were tons of things about HTML5 that they didn't know, things that I thought were common knowledge by now. So I thought, this is it. I'm going to do a talk about HTML secrets, like a potpourri of things that people may not know about HTML. And I hope that by the end of it, you'll have learned a few new things, even if not everything is new to you. However, there are a few things that this talk is not about. I'm sure you must have seen at least a few of these new HTML5 elements. They add extra semantics to your content. And this is exactly why I'm not going to talk very much about them. I love them. I use them all the time. I think they make your code much more readable. I mean, compare this with this. And they add the area roles automatically without you having to know or think about what area role is needed. That said, I don't think they're particularly interesting. They don't really do anything. I wanted to focus on HTML elements that actually do stuff, that actually save you some JavaScript, or even save you writing JavaScript altogether. So we're not going to talk about these kinds of elements. We're also not going to discuss browser support, because it's very much in flux, and yes, it's not in flux right at the moment that I'm giving the talk. But the thing is, even if something that I'm discussing is not supported everywhere, it might be supported in a month or 2 months. And at the rate that browsers are updating today, after a new version is released, a few months later, everybody's updated. So not exactly like that on mobile. So you should, if you really care about browser support, you should always check Can I Use, which has much more updated information than pretty much any other resource. But mainly, one of the reasons I'm not discussing browser support is that HTML elements, HTML features are really easy to polyfill. It's not like CSS, where if something is not supported, it's a huge mess to polyfill it. Well, until the new Houdini APIs, but those are a long way from now. So pretty much everything that we're going to discuss today there's a polyfill for it. Most of the things we're going to discuss today are not universally supported. They have decent support. I'm not going to mention anything that isn't supported anywhere, for example. Well, except one thing, but I'm going to tell you about that. But there's a polyfill for everything. And the good thing about using polyfills over the good thing of using polyfills over scripts with custom APIs is that you're bound to the scripts. If you use jQuery UI, you're bound to use jQuery UI forever in that project. you might decide to change at some point in the future in another project, but in that one, you have to go in and change your code if you want to stop using jQuery UI. Whereas with polyfills, at some point, the thing you use is supported everywhere, and you can just remove the script. And if you use a script loader, you don't, these browsers don't even have to download the polyfill in the first place, because you do a feature test, and you only download the polyfill if you want to. There's actually an amazing service. I'm not mentioning it in the slides because it doesn't have any HTML polyfills as of now. It's called polyfill.io. And at least for JavaScript polyfills, it checks what your browser is and only sends down the features that it actually needs polyfilled. So you don't even have to spend any extra HTTP requests, download anything if the browser doesn't need it. I hope they add HTML polyfills. That would be great. So I'm not going to mention specific polyfills because there are so many for everything. I suggest that if you're looking for a polyfill for something, you just go to GitHub. You just go to GitHub, you search the feature with polyfill after it, and then sort by stars. This is essential, because there are tons of things that aren't maintained. Sort by stars or forks, pick the one with the most, or you can review all of them and see which one suits your needs. Maybe one of them is very complete, but you don't care that much about this feature. You're only using it in a basic way. You don't want to load a huge polyfill that follows the spec to the letter. Maybe you want something smaller that polyfills exactly what you want. So with that, enough about that. Let's discuss what the talk is actually about. So the first thing I want to discuss is the download attribute on A elements. So this is a link. I'm sure you've used tons of those kinds of links. It's to a JavaScript file. If I click on it, it opens it. But what if I didn't want people to open like a JavaScript file and look at this ugliness? I just wanted people to click on the link that says Prism.js and download Prism.js. So this is exactly why the download attribute exists. And it's just as simple as that. I can just add it on any AI element, and now if I click on this, it prompts to download. And I don't have to do anything server-side. I don't have to change the MIME type. I don't have to care. It's just one simple attribute, and I can even toggle it via JavaScript. Here's another example of a similar script. In this case, the script is generated client-side via data URI. If I click on it, it opens in a separate tab. So what if I want this one to be downloadable? Some of you might know there is this trick. Since this is a data URI, I can just change the MIME type to application/octet stream. And now it prompts me to download. And it has a default download file name, because what would it put there? Unfortunately, not every browser acts the same way. So Firefox, if I use this trick and I try to click on it, this is the default file name it gives me. And it says it's a DMS file. I mean, you're web developers, you probably know what's going on here, but if this was a normal user, they'd be like, what is happening here? This site is trying to do something fishy. So the good thing is, if you use the download attribute, you can provide a file name. Can be whatever you want. And then that's the file name that the browser prompts the user to. That's the placeholder file name for the file. So this is strictly superior to the old MIME type technique, although that is still useful as a fallback. Now, input type equals file. I'm sure you've used it a lot of times. I'm sure many of you hate it. As was mentioned previously, it's terrible to style, but I'm not going to talk about styling. So who of you remember the accept attribute from HTML4? Yeah, it never became very popular because, well, at the time of HTML4, it was very poorly supported, but also because it let you restrict the accepted file types, but just by providing MIME types, like image/PNG, image/JPEG. So in HTML5, this attribute was extended to have a much more flexible syntax. So you can see that now I'm using it in its HTML4 form, and if I click on Choose File, all of the PNG and JPEG files are enabled, and I can select them, but I cannot select, for example, any SVG files. Do I have any GIFs here? I don't have any GIFs here. OK. So I can only select PNG and JPEG files. In HTML5, I can specify a generic MIME type, like image/*. And now I can select any image, including SVGs. But if I navigate one level up, you'll see that I can't select a CSS file, for example. It also got another extension. I can specify file extensions now. And now can only download PNGs and GIFs. This is useful for like custom file types if I'm requiring some kind of weird file type that it doesn't have a generic MIME type for. There are generic MIME types for image, video, audio, text, but there aren't generic MIME types for everything. So in those cases, it might be useful to require a specific extension. But in general, if there's a generic MIME type that covers your use case, do not explicitly specify the extensions, because then you're probably excluding a ton of image files, for example, that you haven't thought of. Like, why Twitter doesn't let me upload an SVG avatar? I don't know, but I'm pretty sure some developer there maybe never considered the case. Maybe some developer there just specified a list of extensions. Don't do that. Another thing is, if I'm using input type equals file, I can select specific files, but what if I want to select multiple? My OS does allow me to drag a rectangle here, but it doesn't seem to be doing anything. However, in HTML5, I can enable this control to accept multiple files by just adding a multiple attribute. And the first thing you might have noticed is that now the label of the button became choose files, because now I can choose multiple. And now this works. And of course, command clicking and everything. And if I select multiple files, it just tells me 2 files. If I select one, it acts the same way as it usually does. And this is pretty good browser support, by the way. Another element that many people don't know about is dialog. The way we normally do dialogues today, especially modal dialogues, is a series of divs. Sometimes people use new, more semantic elements like sections, and they make them modal by putting a backdrop behind them. So in HTML5, we got a new element so that we can make things actually modal. And some of you might have heard of an old IE API for making modal dialogues. As you'll see, this is much better than that. This is much smoother than that. So by default, if I use a dialog element with no content, I don't see anything. I can make it visible by default by adding an open attribute to it. And now it's visible by default. But it's not modal. If I have a button behind it, if I have a huge button behind it so I can actually see it, yes, I can actually click that button. So how do I actually open modal dialogues? The sad news is you can't do that straight from HTML. You have to use a little bit of JavaScript. But I promise it will be a little bit and it won't hurt at all. So let's remove the open attribute for now. And I'm going to do this, yes. And dialog is a reference to the dialog element. And the method is showModal. So now, if I click open, it opens my dialog. It's automatically centered in the screen. And it automatically has a backdrop behind it that dims the screen. And it's actually modal. Nothing else behind it works. And unlike the backdrops that we fake, even keyboard interaction doesn't work. I can't tab to this button. And as you might have noticed, it has no close button, so how the hell do I get out of there? I can just press escape. So these dialogues are also keyboard accessible by default, even if you don't bother to make them keyboard accessible, even if you don't think about keyboard accessibility. They're just accessible by default. You might have started thinking, OK, this is nice, but how do I customize this dimming behind it? I mean, it's not dark enough. I can still see everything behind it. So along with dialog, we also got a new CSS pseudo element, backdrop. And in my case, let's say I want to make these dialogues pink. The backdrop of this dialog, so I'm going to make it pink. There. That looks about right. So now the backdrop's pink, just with that. By the way, if escape is a good way to close it, but most people also want to add an escape button, a close button. People don't usually think of pressing escape, partly because the web is so bad at being keyboard accessible that people don't even think it will work. But anyway, it's actually very easy to do a close button as well. It's just dialog.close. And yes, it needs some styling, but you get the idea. So I know that some of you might be thinking, what is this on click there? What is this on click there? My skin is crawling. So yes, there will be some inline event handlers here when I'm going to show JavaScript sometimes. It's just for demo purposes. Don't go about and put inline event handlers in your JavaScript like it's 1999. But it's very convenient for slides because I don't need to have a separate place for JavaScript. I can just show you a demo with everything in it. So with that disclaimer, let's move on. Another cool thing about Dialog is that Forms got a new method that has nothing to do with HTTP. It's method equals dialog. So the first thing that you might notice about this is that if you have a form with a method of dialog, any submit button also closes the dialog that contains the form. But also notice that I have 3 submit buttons here. And they're not type equals submit because that's the default value. But I have 3 submit buttons here. So how do I figure out which one was pressed? How do I figure out if my user is actually a cat or not? So let's put a div here, or a p. Let's call it result. So another cool thing about these types of these forms with method equals dialog is that when the dialog closes, it has a return value property with the value of the button that was pressed. So dialogs also have a close event, so I'm going to use this. And when the dialog closes, I want the text content of the result paragraph to be the dialog's return value. Why this again? I swear this problem only happens when I'm on stage. Yes, now I refreshed, I pasted the exact same code I had, and now it works. It baffles me. It's exactly the same code I had written. But anyway, it works. So if I press yes, it's yes. If I press no, it's no. If I press file not found, it's the actual value of the button. It's not the label, which was 404. So the talk right before me was about iframes. And it did mention some of the things I wanted to mention. Well, kind of all the things I wanted to mention about iframes. And I was really struggling. Should I remove this part from my talk? I still had a few minutes. Like, should I remove it? And I decided to keep it. It's very short. Some people might not remember these things. It has a live demo. So I decided to keep it. So this is a very basic iframe with about blank, which shows nothing. As you know, I can have a data URI inside it. What you might not know is, if I put text/HTML, I can put some content there. It's malformed HTML, doesn't matter, it still displays. What you might not know is that text also works. And actually, anything here works. Of course, it's not HTML anymore. Like this will actually show, it won't render a paragraph, because the default MIME type is text plain. I actually discovered this 5 minutes before my talk, but I thought I would mention it anyway, because I thought it was really cool. You do need the comma, otherwise it's just broken. So let's go back to text HTML. So if I have a paragraph here that says foo, or whatever, as you know, this works. As you might remember from the previous talk, we also got an src doc attribute in HTML5 to make this easier. So if I change this to src doc, suddenly my entire data URI becomes content. I can remove this. Technically, I need to include a body element. I don't have to include a doc type or a title, but I do have to include a body. But as you also know, browsers do render malformed HTML, so I don't have to type a body just to show you that this works. So you might be wondering, what is the point of getting src doc if I can do this already with the data URI? There are a few differences, and the difference will become more clear once I start adding scripts to it. But first, exactly, if you don't care about security particularly, if you're just using an iframe to isolate some stuff, then you can actually polyfill src doc by using data URIs. The main idea looks sort of like this. You test if the src, if any iframe element contains an src doc property, because every time a new attribute is added, we also get a new property, usually with the same name, not always. So you can test if a new iframe contains an src doc property, and if it doesn't, you can just override its source with a data URI that contains the src doc, and you have a very basic polyfill in like 4 lines. But anyway, what happens if we put a script in here? So this shows, which makes it kind of bad for displaying untrusted content, doesn't it? Which is why, okay, I'm gonna make this invalid, because this is really annoying. So one of the main reason we got src doc is not for making data URIs more convenient. The main reason we got src doc is security, is so we can use it along with another new property called sandbox. And by default, sandbox disables pretty much all of the permissions it can disable. So if I uncomment my alert now, as you can see, nothing happens. You can enable specific permissions, like allow scripts, but as you'll see again, nothing happens, because it's not sufficient to enable scripts to be able to see alerts. You also need to allow modals. And as you can see now, it appears. So you might be wondering, okay, yeah, you told us about sandbox. I can use the sandbox with a data URI in src, right? The problem is that this would make developers really hard to trust sandbox, because they'd be like, okay, if a browser supports sandbox, then it's secure. If the browser doesn't support sandbox, the iframe is still insecure, so I can't use this. So we got this new attribute that browsers vouch to support together with sandbox. I mean, there are browsers that support sandbox but not src doc, I believe, but everybody that supports src doc also supports sandbox. So you can rest assured that you can put potentially malicious content in src doc, and you can rest assured that it will either not display at all or follow the permissions you set in the sandbox, which is not true for data URIs in src, because these worked for ages. And there are a bunch of permissions. Though only the first 2 have to do with HTML. The rest of them are all related to JavaScript. Yeah, that was the short section on iframes. I hope it was still useful. So input type equals range, as you probably have seen before, create sliders. I think sliders are pretty exciting compared to other HTML elements. This is a very basic slider. You probably know that there's a min and a max. The min is 0 by default. You can set it to whatever. There's a max, which is 100 by default. You can set it to whatever. Surprisingly, this seems to work because it goes back to 0 and 100 because this is invalid. But if I set them to be the same value, I can just not. It's like it doesn't do anything. I can set them to be only one apart. And then it acts like those iPhone switches. Or I can return them to their defaults and use step. And if step is 100, it acts like a switch again. But it can be anything. It can be 0.1. Anyway, this is not about how sliders work. And there are many good things and bad things about sliders. I hope you're not among these people that don't use native sliders because you think you can't style them. You can actually style them. It's horribly painful. It's one of the worst things you'll ever have to do in web development, but still it's worth styling these native sliders over using some separate component because they display in an appropriate way in every browser. On mobile, they're something completely, they could be something completely different. They are not, but theoretically on a small screen, they could be completely different. They're very keyboard accessible. They're localized. They're internationalized. There's a lot of effort that has gone into making these sliders usable. So don't use fake sliders. It's not great to use proprietary pseudo elements to style them, but it's much better than using fake sliders with questionable usability. And to prove how much you can do custom things with these sliders, here's a gallery by Anna Tudor, who has styled native sliders in all sorts of interesting ways. Many of these even are pure CSS. I think about half. And yes, what would be required to style a slider in a custom way, even something as simple as that, like a hue slider in a color picker, for example, is something that looks like this. It is ugly as, it's pretty ugly. But anyway, what I thought was exciting about this section was not how sliders work and that sliders exist. I assume you know that sliders exist. One of the very little known features about sliders is that they also accept a multiple attribute, just like the file input. And what does the multiple attribute do on sliders? It gives us two handles. It doesn't give us like 3 or 4 or 5 or any arbitrary number. It's limited at 2, but it gives us two handles. And then we could specify ranges, which I always thought was the purpose of input type equals range, right? It implies that it lets you pick a range, not that it lets you pick from a range. But yeah, naming is not the strong suit of either the HTML working group or WebWG. So as you can see, I can select a range here. Of course, the value now is multi-valued. It has two values separated by a comma. One of the bad things about this, as exciting as it might be, that is not supported anywhere yet. That's the one thing I warned you about. Multiple on range inputs is not supported anywhere at the moment. But there is a polyfill, which is how I was able to show you. And I wrote it specifically for this talk. And released it like 2 weeks before. And it's very small. It's like 0.6 kilobytes. It's like less than a kilobyte. So there was an autocomplete attribute on HTML4. It just accepted. It was the attribute you used when autocomplete became annoying and you wanted to make it disappear, like can it just go away? It's breaking my UX. However, in HTML5, it got a ton more usefulness. So let's remember a bit how autocomplete works in browsers. I have an input with a name of email here. For some reason, it's not showing any suggestions, but if I wrap it with a form, it does. Which I found particularly weird, because it didn't used to happen before, so I think it's a Chrome update. So it's suggesting fields from previous email forms from previous forms I have filled with the same name. As you can see, if instead of email, I put txt email here, because I have filled in a form with my MIT email, it suggests just that one email, even though I have actually 3 emails and Chrome knows about this. The reason is that Chrome doesn't know that this is actually an email field. And he pretends not to know that it's an email field, even if I put type equals email here. Because, you know, it could be like your friend's email or something, not your email, so I'm not going to suggest your emails. So it's only matching on name. However, in HTML5, the autocomplete attribute can also provide hints. So I can say autocomplete equals email. And now it gives me all the emails I have registered with Chrome. And I can even add more for future forms. And this is not just limited to email either. There are all these fields that we got. And you can even combine them with modifiers like shipping address or billing address. You might have noticed that there are also some credit card hints. Those require HTTPS. What happens if I use them without HTTPS? This happens. Automatic credit card filling is disabled because this form does not use a secure connection. I'm sorry for the ones at the back. I know these are tiny letters, but there's absolutely no way to make this bigger. I tried transforms, I tried font size, I tried everything. There's just no way to make this bigger. So I have this open in HTTPS here from GitHub. Whoa. And as you can see, it's showing, can this just go away? Okay. Weird Chrome UI. So as you can see, if I press the down arrow, and you can see what I'm pressing here. If I press the down arrow, or even just start filling, okay, it's just the down arrow. I guess that's good for security. It shows me the 2 credit cards I have entered. One of them is for the purposes of this talk, and it's not actually real. The other one I should try not to step on. So notice this thing. I press the down arrow, I select the first item, I press enter, nothing happens. Why? Because, again, it's not in a form. It's very weird behavior because there are tons of form elements these days that are used outside of a form because not everything happens server-side. But now, once I add a form, just navigating there puts the information in. And the good thing is, I can fill an entire form that way. Like, if I put name here, it suggests 2 forms, two cards. And if I select them, it fills in the entire information of the card. If I had expiry date, it would just fill everything. So this was the autocomplete attribute in HTML5 was very largely unknown until very recently, where this article made the rounds. You might have seen it. How many have actually seen this article? It was all over Twitter. Okay, a few, but not everybody. So if this sounds like something that you might find useful, go and read this article right after this talk. It's amazing, and it goes into much more detail than I could because I have to talk about 10 things. So another very hyped feature of HTML5 was Datalist. This is a very basic example that you might have seen in demos. It's like a country field with 3 countries. If I press the down arrow, I can see all of them. If I start typing, I see the ones that start with it. Note that this behavior is not consistent across browsers, because just like everything that is unspecified in the HTML spec. So Chrome matches from the beginning. Firefox matches everywhere. So let's suppose I wanted to show the United Kingdom flag next to it, and not just the name. I can think, hey, I don't even need icons these days. Emoji includes flags. So I can bring up the OSX emoji picker, and I can select the United Kingdom country flag. But now, my data list broke. It's not showing United Kingdom anymore, because the flag is actually just another character. In fact, if for some weird reason I decide to write the flag, then it autocompletes, because people do that in their forms, right? However, fear not and despair not, because there is a solution to show flags and emojis, all the emojis. there is a label attribute that allows us to display presentational text that is not used in the matching. And I will add the emoji there. And now, you can see that the label is over here. It's kind of tiny, and like I said, there's no way to change the size of this damn pop-up. But it's better than nothing. It's there, right? Alternatively, I can put it at the end, if stylistically that's okay. Well, I guess there could be a solution where you put it at the end, and then you reverse United Kingdom, and then you apply some direction right to left. But no, don't do that. I'm not. And you can even put any kind of character here. So now it even has a label. I think it looks quite nice. It's a nice enhancement. It doesn't really take much effort. It's not great. I would prefer the icons to be bigger. I mean, it's such a nicely designed icon. I mean, look at this. But it is what it is. A little known fact about Datalist is that it can be used on non-textual inputs as well, like input type equals range. And it creates ticks. And yes, there are many ways to draw ticks on a range input that do not involve Datalist. You can draw them with SVG. You can draw them with CSS gradients. However, none of these gives you the behavior of ticks, which is the snapping. I'm not sure if you can see this. It's more like something you can feel, but maybe it's a little bit visible. Like when I'm moving closer to the tick, it snaps to it. And also, I don't have to add ticks at regular intervals. Maybe if a few values are more important, I can just highlight these values by putting ticks there. And theoretically, in the spec, there's also it should also support the label attribute, just like with textual inputs, and it should show the full label like above the tick. This is not supported anywhere, sadly. So you probably have seen input type equals color before. It invokes the the native OS color picker, which is really nice on Mac OS and really terrible on Windows, but it's something. Sadly, it only supports values in 6-digit hex, so this will not work. It just shows black. Sadly, also things like these will not work, which sucks because I love HSL colors, but what can you do? So one little known fact about color inputs is that they also work with Datalist. So this is what happens if I link a color input to a Datalist. It shows me a color palette. And then I can select other, and then it invokes the OS native color picker. But I think that's pretty cool for many use cases. Again, if I provide an option that is not valid, it just doesn't show up. And label doesn't really do anything. But we have something. Two elements in HTML5 that were also very, very hyped were details and summary, because they gave us real functionality that we need all the time. Like we keep writing this script over and over again. I mean, we've even gone to extents of using like checkboxes to be able to do it in CSS, like hidden checkboxes where you click on the label and it toggles the checkbox, and then you use the checked pseudo class to toggle the visibility of another element. It's just such a huge mess. But in HTML5, we got elements to show and hide content natively. This is what it looks like by default: a details element and a summary element. And I can put whatever content I want inside it. And then I use the summary element to toggle the display of the content. And as you can see, it adds an open attribute, which I can also add by default if I want it to be initially open. But an interesting thing is that unlike many other controls in HTML, it's actually adding an attribute to the element. It's not just setting an open property, it's actually changing the attribute, which is super useful because you don't end up with these weird cases of like checkboxes that have a checked attribute, but actually if you do .checked, it's false because the user unchecked them, which I think confuses people endlessly when they learn HTML. So I'm glad things are moving towards this direction. The main thing I wanted to tell you, though, is not just that details and summary exist. I assume many of you know that they exist. But it's also that they have their own special event called toggle. And this enables you to really easily use details and summary in a way that is not the default. Look at this. I've added two summary elements, and I can open both of them. What if I wanted an accordion? What if I wanted something that works like this? Well, actually, this is also using details and summary, a bit more styled than the previous example, with a tiny bit of JavaScript. And stay with me, it's only like 6 lines of JavaScript. I'm adding a toggle event to the body. I'm using capturing. This is what the third parameter stands for, because toggle doesn't bubble. And I want to capture all of them at the body level so that I don't have to attach individual events to every details element I add. And then I'm checking, is this element inside any element with a class of accordion? Because I don't want random details elements to have this behavior. So I get the accordion that they're inside. And if the details element is open, event.target will always be a details element. Like nothing else at this point, at least, has a toggle event. So if it's open and the accordion exists, then I'm going to go over all of the details elements inside that accordion, except the one that was currently clicked, and close them. So it looks like this. The $$ just gets all the details elements inside this accordion as an array. It's sort of like query selector all, but it returns an array. And we loop over them. This is the variable that holds each details element. And we check if this details element is different than the event target, then we close it by setting its open property to false. And that's all. And we have an accordion. Also, you might be thinking, this is all nice, and I can probably style details and summary like normal CSS elements, but how do I style this marker, this arrow that becomes an arrow pointing down when I open it? So you can't right now. Well, you can in some browsers with some proprietary pseudo elements, as with form controls and many other things. So there are proprietary pseudo elements for this, but we are in the process of standardizing it. And it's going to work with the marker pseudo element, which is also going to be used for list items. So, for example, if you wanted to have a plus and minus, it would look like this. But this does not work yet. We also got a ton of new things in HTML for validation. And in general, this was also a very hyped feature, a set of hyped features, but not all of their details. So in HTML4, we had max length on inputs. As you know, it limited how much we could type. In HTML5, we also got min length, which forces us to write at least a certain number of characters before we can submit the form. So, of course, the browser, the UI of the browser forces you to not type more than 10 characters. It just doesn't let you type. How do you enforce min length? Do you grab the user from the neck and be like, type something here, and it has to be 5 characters? Well, we can't do that. So instead, controls now have an invalid state called the suffering state in the spec, as you heard earlier. And if I type some content in there, and it's not longer than 5 characters, then the control is invalid, as you can see by the background. The background is not actually applied by the browser. By default, invalid and valid are visually indistinguishable. It's instead applied by the pseudo class. If I remove this, there is absolutely no difference. But in most cases, it's very helpful to visually distinguish these two styles. There's actually a valid pseudo class as well, which now shows me red if the control is valid, which you shouldn't really do unless you want to seriously troll people. Wait, I need to change it back first. One thing about min length is, if I set it to 2 characters, I have to type at least 1 character. So if I only type at least 2 characters, if I only type 1, it's invalid. So you would assume that if I set it to 1, then I would need to type something in the field, right? However, it does not seem to have an invalid state. Min length does not work like that. It doesn't do anything in these cases. Like, all of constraint validation doesn't seem to apply if you haven't typed anything in the field, except that we got a special attribute for this, required, which does exactly that. I don't need min length equals 1 anymore. So now the field is invalid only when there's nothing typed into it. Another attribute that I'm most excited about is pattern, which lets you specify any regular expression for the input's contents. So now I've specified a pattern of A, so I can only type 1A in this field, nothing else. Everything else is invalid, 1A. It becomes much more useful if I can type any number of A's. But still, like, you don't usually ask people to just type the character A, right? It becomes much more useful if you start using more regular expression features, like if I want the user to just type letters. So now I can type any letter, uppercase or lowercase, but if I type a number, it stops working. Which is, well, I can add digits here as well. So now it works with digits as well, but not with symbols, for example. Anyway, this is not a talk about regular expression syntax. There is actually a website that, it's not loading. I am connected. Anyway, you can see the URL over there, HTML5pattern.com, that gives you patterns you can just copy and paste. One thing I thought was really cool about pattern is that you can also set it dynamically. So I can have an input here that sets the pattern for the second input. So if I do something like this, then I can type the pattern here, and it gets applied to this. So I've basically made like a regular expression tester with like 2 lines of HTML. Well, and then 1 line of JavaScript, but still. Like, there are a lot of these regular expression testers, and now they're super easy to make. Now it has to be a series of B's and a series of F's, but nothing else. Anyway, I thought that was cool. So here I've put pattern on a text area. It does not seem to be working. Why is it not working? Well, actually, it's not working because Hixie thought that patterns in text areas are not very useful. People don't usually need to constrain the result of the input in the text area. I disagree. I've come across many cases where it was useful. For example, recently, I had to prevent users from typing too many words in a text area. So the thing is, you cannot use pattern like this, but it's very easy to sort of polyfill it. Because we didn't just get this series of attributes in HTML5. We also got, I mean, when you can use a declarative way, use declarative way. But we also got an API. And one of its methods is element.set custom validity. It's kind of a weird one, because the parameter is a string that sets the message you're going to display to the user. But it controls 2 things. is the control valid? And also, what message should I display? And it kind of sets both at once. Like, if you want to say that the element is actually valid, you just provide an empty string, which I think is kind of a weird paradigm, but it works. So you can do on input again. And this will be kind of long, so let me save some space. And for testing purposes, let's first put just error here. So anything I type is invalid now, just by default. Even absolutely nothing, which is very unlike how the declarative ways work. OK, now let's create a regular expression for the actual pattern that I have here. It's getting a bit long. And if this is true, then it passes through, oh, I need to test as well. God, this will need to be multiple lines. So we test if this value passes. If it passes, it's not an error. Otherwise, it's an error. So if the pattern is A, notice that this doesn't quite work like the input pattern. As long as it contains an A, it passes. And I can type anything else there. The reason is that we're just passing the value of the pattern attribute directly to the regular expressions constructor. But that's not exactly what the pattern attribute does. What it does is it matches if the entire input matches with the regular expression that we provided in pattern. So if we're doing this by hand, if we're doing this manually, we have to create an appropriate regular expression. So we need to concatenate with this, which means it has to start with whatever I put after it, and with the $sign, which means it has to end with whatever I put there. So now it does work in the same way I expected. As long as I only type A's, it's OK. But if I type anything else, it doesn't work. And if I click submit, it says error, which was the error message I wrote here. Please use more descriptive messages than just error. One cool application of this is how you can check if a file a user is about to upload matches a certain limit by one line of JavaScript, basically. So we use set custom validity on the change event, and we check if the file that the user selected, just the first one in this case, if you have multiple, you need to adjust accordingly. So we check if the file size is bigger than some arbitrary limit, and we display an error message if it is. Otherwise, we don't. So let's see how this works out. I'm going to pick a large image. And if I try to submit, it says file over 75K, which is the message I've specified. You can actually, one cool idea, I think, is if you use the max length attribute, which officially doesn't really do anything on input type equals file. So treat this as more of a pattern than anything. But you can put the limit there and then not have to change the JavaScript depending on what the limit is for every particular file input. You just change the HTML. So this should work. It will display our limit in bytes because that's just what we put there. But you can refine this. So the last thing I want to talk about today, do I have time? I do. OK. Is structured data. How many of you know what structured data is? Wow. OK. Not that many. So have you seen these types of Google results? So I've searched for truffle risotto, I was looking for a recipe, and notice that some Google results have ratings next to them, and some really cool information like 23 reviews, 50 minutes, 499 calories. How does Google know about this? Does it actually parse the text? Is it that intelligent these days? Does it actually understand what the pages are about? Not really. The thing is, these pages have taken the effort to mark up which parts of their HTML display this kind of information. How many reviews do they have? What's the rating? And there are many ways to mark this information up, and Google understands pretty much all of them. So let's look at the rating first. If you look at allrecipes.com, and I picked that just because its markup seemed a little bit more reasonable, you will find somewhere something that looks like this. How many of you know what these attributes are? Okay, so these are microdata. And microdata is just the syntax. Microdata is the attributes, item prop, item scope, item type, all these. The names of the properties don't have anything to do with microdata. Microdata doesn't specify any names of properties. It just specifies how to provide names. Instead, it's schema.org that provides the names of the properties. So schema.org is a separate website that lists things that you might want to mark up in your pages and what properties you could use. Because that way, if we all agree on the names of these properties, things like Google or Pinterest or Facebook can pick up these property names and do useful things with them. And it's not just Google that picks them up. I mentioned Pinterest, I mentioned Facebook. They also pick up at least a form of this kind of thing. So in this example, it's using microdata and a vocabulary from schema.org. These are called vocabularies. A vocabulary is just a series of property names, but there are others. There's one called Open Graph Protocol by Facebook. If you've viewed source at multiple at pages and you've seen this OG colon, how many of you have seen that? Pretty much all of you. Okay, so if you've seen this OG colon, that's what it means. These pages are using Open Graph. And that's because there are many services that expect you that only read that, like Facebook. So there are two components, the vocabulary, the names of the properties and all that, and the encoding, which is how you specify these names. How do you specify what everything is? And in that case, it was microdata, but there are many others. There's RDFA, there's JSON-LD. Note that microformats, I've mentioned microformats in both, because microformats tries to do both. Microformats is basically adding classes to certain types of classes to HTML elements to denote their meaning. It has the benefit that developers feel more comfortable with classes than special attributes. Unfortunately, some people that haven't heard about microdata, there are many stories that they come later, they see these classes, they're like, we don't use these classes anywhere, we don't use these classes in our CSS, they remove them. Also, I don't think it's particularly maintainable to have the same people maintaining the syntax and the vocabulary. So personally, I would recommend using any of the other technologies, any of them. They're all good. They're all, and they have much wider support. I mean, Google does read microformats. I don't think Facebook does. I need to check, but I think Facebook does not read microformats. So how would the same piece of data look with other vocabularies and other encodings? So here it's the same vocabulary from schema.org, but it's encoded with RDFA. So RDF in general got a super bad rep because, well, RDF is super confusing, especially this XML-based RDF with all these namespaces and colons everywhere, and it just looks like ASCII puke. RDFA was a step to the right direction by W3C trying to make RDF a bit more friendly. It still has a long way to go. If you look at the RDFA spec, it's just a long, incomprehensible mess. But there is RDFA Lite, which is actually what Google recommends, which is a subset of RDFA that is one-for-one match, pretty much one-for-one matches microdata. So instead of item prop, it uses property. Instead of item scope and item type, it uses typeof, which I think is more reasonable, because why would you use two attributes that always go together? Like, what's the point? Just use one. And it also separates the vocabulary from the type. Note that in the previous example, the vocabulary is in the same place as the name of the type. So even if everything in your document uses the same vocabulary, you have to keep specifying it over and over and over again. So personally, I think that RDFA actually looks nicer. I don't say it very much because, you know, RDFA has a very bad rep, so people start thinking less of you if you say that you like it. So it's kind of a guilty pleasure. This is how it looks with JSON LD. So because aggregate rating was actually a part of the review, that's why I have the ellipsis here. This is actually bigger. So actually, this is what Google prefers for some reason. If you look at their documentation for these structured snippets, they call them, rich snippets, something like that, they suggest this before anything else. They also have microdata examples, they have RDFA examples, but they really promote JSON LD for some reason, which I don't understand why, because, yeah, JSON is nice, but why would you have a separate island in your page, like a separate script that doesn't really do anything except tell Google and other services what the data in the page is, when you can actually point to where you're displaying the data to the user? Like both microdata, microformats, RDFA, they're all in the HTML. So you can display the data, like you can display the 4.95 to the user and mark it up with semantics. JSON LD doesn't do any of that. It's much easier for machines to parse, I assume, but that's not a good enough reason. We can parse HTML. And this is the same, well, the closest thing I could find to an aggregate rating in microformats. It looks like you have to specify an FN property as well. But you can see it's all with classes. It might look more friendly. I think it's a little verbose. This example with changed numbers and data is actually taken from their docs. So that's what they're recommending. And this is also a rating specified in Open Graph with RDFA. So they recommend using this namespace. And it looks like it works even if you don't define it somehow. So if you look at the All Recipes website, it actually uses both. So I would recommend you do the same. Some websites parse Open Graph, others expect schema.org, others understand both. It's not really that much more cost. If it's important information to the page, mark it up with both. So let's go back to these results. We've talked about the rating, but what about all the other information? So the rating is not the only piece of information that's marked up in that page. If you look higher up, you'll see that the rating is actually part of a bigger type called recipe, which they define like this. And then they have two bits of information that aren't actually shown. So one thing to keep in mind is that link and meta become perfectly valid anywhere as long as they have an item prop or a property attribute. Even if the validator disagrees, the validator is just not updated. HTML5 is supposed to include microdata and RDFA natively, and it should validate. And if it doesn't, it's a bug in the validator. And note that this main entity of page is an attribute, is a property that all types have, and all schema.org types have. And what it basically says is, this whole page is about this recipe. That's the main thing here. That's the main entity. And the URL of the recipe is actually the URL of the current page. It also provides an image with an item prop of image and an H1 with the name of the recipe. And this is where Google takes the little image that it displays. Note that both RDFA and microdata and microformats do have a concept of where is the data. The data is not always in the contents of the element. In most elements, the data are inside them. Like in an H1 element, the data is risotto with truffle and parmesan, which is the element's contents. But what happens with, what about elements that don't have contents, or elements with, where the contents are of less importance than an attribute? So there's this concept of a primary attribute, which some elements have. Like in an image, if you put a property on an image or an item prop, the data is in the src attribute. On a time element, it's in the date time attribute. On an A element, even though it has contents, it's in the href attribute. So we've seen how the image and the title are extracted. This is how all the times are extracted. The prep time, the cook time, the ready time. It's using a time element with a machine-readable duration and a human-readable duration inside the element. And like I said, in a time element, the data is in the datetime attribute, because we care about the machine-readable data when using these things. And unlike the previous example with the rating and the first two elements here, we can see how these elements double as both adding semantics and displaying things to the user, which I think is really important. So I personally am not a huge fan of JSON-LD. I mean, if you're going to store data in JSON, it's trivial to make it JSON-LD and add semantics to it. But if you already have data in your page, I kind of like the idea of marking the same data that you're showing to the user, marking it up for semantics as well. Don't repeat yourself. I actually like that principle. So this has come to an end. I hope you learned something. These are the two specs that define HTML. So why do we have two specs? This is a very long story. It's a big can of worms. And everybody that you ask, depending on where they are, they'll give you a different answer. If they're in the WG or if they're in W3C, they'll give you a completely different answer. I'll try to be impartial and say that there's one main difference. The WG spec is a living standard. Doesn't have any versions. So if you want to link to it, there's no guarantee it will work. Maybe you link to it in your slides, and then you'll find that when you're actually giving the talk, it broke. It happens. They don't particularly care about links that stay that persist in time. On the other hand, W3C has a version model. So there's HTML5, there's HTML5.1, there's HTML5.2. You can link to things. The links don't break. There's a concept of a published version. There's a version history. You can go back to previous versions, see what HTML was like at that state. Personally, I think that's very important. On the other hand, the WG spec does have the benefit of always being cutting edge. W3C has a publication process. Things start in the editor's draft first, and then over time, they will eventually be published in a working draft, and then it will go to candidate recommendation, proposed recommendation, the rules for when it can advance. I mean, if you're W3C savvy, you can always look at the editor's draft instead of the published version, and then it's kind of like a living standard. So you can look at that for cutting edge, and you can look at the published versions for something you can link to. But yeah, those are the main differences. There's a little bit of politics as well, as usual. I'm not going to get into that. So that's about it. My slides are online. Thank you very much.
Leah. Let's have a seat. Directly starting with the end. You were talking about microformats and schema, and then in the end about these specs. And in the morning, I think we had like an opposite opinion. So let's should it be part of a specification? Maybe what is the standard to have these kind of features as you were showing with the recipes?
Mm-hmm. So you think if there
should it be part of a spec, or should it be something that that maybe has to be added? Because there are so many different solutions to the same.
I mean, it depends on what you consider a spec. Is schema.org a spec? It does have a lot of people working behind it. You might consider it a spec. A spec doesn't need to come from W3C. A spec is basically a document that many people agree on. I mean, W3C, what WG is no legal entity. It has no real presence. It's just some browser people that got together. And its documents are still considered specs by most of the community.
Yeah.
So to answer that question, I guess I really need to know what you consider a spec first.
Yeah, that's true. And but in some way, it is interpreted differently by, you say, Facebook and by Google. They all use their own standards.
Yeah,
right?
I mean, it's like the equivalent of browsers in a way.
Yeah.
Like the same problems that you have with browsers, and some of them understand some features and others understand other features, and you need to have fallbacks. It's kind of similar with data as well. Like some of them expect one schema, others expect another. I would love it if these were harmonized. It seems to be rather difficult right now. It's good that they at least got harmonized to a point, like that we have two big vocabularies, and everybody that cares about recognizing data recognizes one of these two forms.
Yeah.
So it's not like having 10 different ones.
Right. Okay. We have Twitter filled with a lot of questions, so again, I will ask you to. It's also filled with stuff like dialogue. Somehow there were a lot of tweets about dialogue, about how great it was. So it's struck a nerve, and that brings up the question: like, how did we miss it, or is it because of the current support?
The support is towards the lower end of the spectrum compared to the other things I mentioned. Actually, let's check it right now. So as you can see, it's relatively bad.
Okay.
Well, I mean, it's like half of the population still.
One of the questions by Dirk Pennings was, how does it do on mobile? Not
very well.
Not very well. What is the current support? Was a question of some other. Yeah, not too well. Okay, but it's.
But like I said in the beginning, everything is polyfillable in HTML. There are tons of polyfills for dialogue.
Right. So maybe now it's not that we're distracted by libraries. It's also because we just can't use it then. Or are we also distracted by libraries? Because you showed a lot of stuff which is in HTML.
I think a lot of the time we're kind of stuck in our ways. Like we've learned to do things a certain way, and we don't usually go out Googling, is there a native way to do this thing right now? I mean, I've seen this even for things that are supported very well. People have learned to do them in a certain thing, and that's what they keep using. I mean, most people don't think, hey, maybe there's a native way to do this. Like either they come across a tutorial that mentions it, or they just don't usually find out about it.
So yeah, people grab maybe JavaScript libraries too soon in some cases. That's the learning to take from your talk. I want to thank you and give you a big applause, because we have to round up, I'm sorry.